Our brains feel like thinking machines. I mean, when you sit down to solve a really complex puzzle or you're pondering the trajectory of your career, or I don't know, even just reading a novel on a quiet Sunday afternoon,
Right.
the intuitive experience is that your brain's primary purpose is to generate thoughts. It
Yeah.
feels like this highly tuned cognitive engine.
Absolutely.
But what if thinking isn't its primary job at all?
Mm.
What if the brain's real mission, the architectural foundation of literally everything it does, is something far more basic, far more primal? What if it is just a biological accounting department managing your body's energy budget to keep you alive?
That is the big question.
Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into the book 7.5 Lessons About the Brain by the renowned neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett.
It's an incredible piece of work.
It really is. And the mission of this specific deep dive is to completely dismantle one of the most popular, most persistent, and honestly most destructive myths in neuroscience and the public imagination. We are going to dismantle the idea of the triune brain.
The three-layered brain.
Exactly. That famous, culturally pervasive concept that you have a primitive lizard brain, an emotional mammal brain, and then a highly evolved rational human brain just sort of layered on top.
And the reason you, as someone listening who's invested in understanding human behavior, need to care about the dismantling of this specific myth is that the outdated triune model is far more than just a harmless scientific footnote.
It's everywhere.
It is the invisible scaffolding for how we interpret almost all human action. It tells us that our daily existence is this constant, epic, unavoidable battle between primitive, ancient instincts and civilized, rational control.
Like an inner tug of war.
Exactly. And we have quite literally built our legal systems, our macroeconomic theories, our educational frameworks, and our mental health treatments around this assumption of an inner tug of war. But modern neuroscience, specifically the fields of evolutionary biology and molecular genetics, reveals that this picture is entirely fabricated. It's completely wrong.
So if we want to truly understand why we do what we do,
We have to look at the brain's actual central evolutionary purpose. And that purpose is not rationality. It is a biological budgeting system known as allostasis.
okay, let's unpack this. Because to really grasp how radical a shift that is, we need to look at the evolutionary timeline.
We have to go way back.
Right, we can't just look at a modern human brain and try to reverse engineer it based on how it feels to us today. The source text takes us back about 550 million years.
The prehistoric oceans.
Yeah, the Earth's oceans are teeming with life. But it is life that, to put it bluntly, did not possess a brain. And this brings us to one of our most distant, fascinating evolutionary cousins.
The amphioxus.
Yes.
If you look at a modern amphioxus today, you are essentially looking at a living fossil. It's a creature remarkably similar to our own ancient, tiny ancestors roaming those prehistoric seas.
It's just this tiny 2-inch translucent worm-like thing, right?
Yeah, it spends most of its life buried in the sandy seafloor, just swaying in the ocean current. What is vital to understand about the amphioxus is the sheer simplicity of its biological existence.
How simple are we talking?
Very simple. It has a basic system for propulsion through the water, but it mostly just plants itself and passively consumes whatever microscopic organisms happen to drift into its mouthplate.
Just waiting for food to show up.
Exactly. It does not possess a sense of taste. It does not have a sense of smell. It has no eyes to resolve images, just a tiny cluster of specialized cells on its head that can detect crude changes in ambient light.
And it can't hear.
No hearing at all,
The author describes it as a stomach on a stick.
which is a brilliant visualization.
It's a wildly evocative way to think about our ancestry. But looking at the biological mechanics, how does a creature like that even survive without a centralized processing unit? If there's no brain, how does it know when to move or when to eat?
It survives through direct, unmediated circuitry. Its nervous system is nothing more than a rudimentary neural tube, just a tiny clump of cells.
Okay.
The sensory cells that detect changes in light or physical touch are connected almost directly to the motor cells that control its muscles.
So there's no middleman.
There is no intermediary. There is no processing, no memory retrieval, no deliberation.
Yeah.
If a sudden shadow falls over its light-sensing cells,
Like a predator swimming over.
right, perhaps indicating a larger creature passing overhead, the signal travels instantaneously to the motor cells, and it blindly darts away.
It just fires.
It just fires.
Hmm.
If organic matter brushes against its feeding apparatus, it ingests it. It is a purely reactive organism. It's a master of its specific, narrow ecological niche. but it possesses absolutely no awareness that it even has an environment. It just reacts to localized stimuli.
But the Earth obviously didn't stay a peaceful, passive buffet of drifting microscopic food. The source text highlights the Cambrian period as a major turning point. The environment changes entirely because of one massive evolutionary invention.
The invention of purposeful hunting.
Yeah.
Sometime during the Cambrian explosion, an organism evolved the rudimentary capability to not just passively filter feed, but to actively sense the presence of another specific organism, track it, and deliberately consume it.
Which is a terrifying upgrade.
Organisms had consumed other organisms before, of course, but it was largely accidental or passive. This was targeted. This was intentional predation.
Which instantly transforms the entire planet into a terrifying, high-stakes competitive arena. You suddenly have an environment where the single most critical, overarching question a biological organism faces every second of its existence
Is that shape in the water going to feed me or is it going to eat me?
exactly. And that triggers this massive arms race.
It triggered the ultimate biological arms race. To survive in a world defined by predators and prey, organisms were subjected to immense selective pressure to evolve better ways to sense the world around them.
Because just sensing light and dark isn't enough anymore.
The amphioxus could only distinguish light from dark, which is completely insufficient when a predator is actively hunting you. So organisms evolved the ability to resolve actual visual images.
They needed to see the teeth.
Right. They evolved a complex vestibular system to understand their body's orientation and movement in three-dimensional space. They developed highly attuned tactile sensors to detect microscopic vibrations in the water.
Which modern sharks still use, right?
Yes, it's a mechanism modern sharks still rely on heavily to locate thrashing prey from miles away.
Okay, I understand the pressure for better sensory equipment, but having high-definition vision or incredible vibration detection doesn't save you if you can't physically maneuver away from the threat.
True.
If you can clearly see the predator coming, but your motor system is just that old amphioxus blind dart in a random direction, you are still going to be consumed.
Precisely. The arms race demanded not just sophisticated sensory input, but infinitely more complex motor output. Organisms had to develop articulated appendages, fins, complex musculature to dart, turn, pivot, and dive with extreme precision.
They needed to steer.
They needed calculated navigation, not random wriggling. But here is the critical biological constraint that emerged in this arms race.
Energy.
Yes. Building and operating these new sensory and motor systems required massive amounts of energy. Every time a creature chased a potential meal or fled from a perceived threat, it burned through its internal resources.
So if it chased prey but moved inefficiently and missed,
It wasted energy. If it burned up all its reserves fleeing from a shadow that turned out to be a harmless piece of kelp, it depleted the resources it desperately needed to survive an actual attack later that day.
so efficiency becomes the ultimate metric of survival.
Absolutely.
This brings us to the core mechanism Barrett outlines in the book, the concept that completely reframes the brain's purpose: allostasis. For anyone who usually associates the brain purely with cognition, memory, or emotion, this concept completely flips the script. Let's dig into the actual biological mechanics of this budgeting system.
Allostasis literally translates to anticipating needs before they arise to maintain stability. The author utilizes a highly effective financial budget analogy.
Like a bank account.
Exactly. Consider how a household budget tracks currency as it is earned, saved, and spent. Your body possesses a similar, albeit infinitely more complex biological budget that meticulously tracks metabolic resources.
Like what kind of resources?
We are talking about the precise systemic regulation of water, salt, glucose, oxygen, and various circulating hormones. Every single physical action an organism takes.
Swimming, looking around.
Contracting a muscle to swim, dilating pupils to see in dim light, increasing heart rate to pump oxygen. Every single one of those is a literal withdrawal from this biological bank account.
And the deposits.
Conversely, actions like consuming nutrient-dense food, drinking water, and entering a restorative sleep state are metabolic deposits. Running a biological machine is astronomically expensive.
It costs a lot to stay alive.
And therefore, every single action, every twitch of a fin is fundamentally an economic choice evaluated by the organism's nervous system.
I'm trying to square that with the timeline, though. As these bodies grew more complex over millions of years, they weren't just a stomach and a simple neural tube anymore.
No, they became vastly more complicated.
They started integrating massive, intricate internal organs. You have a cardiovascular system with a pressurized, heart-pumping, nutrient-rich blood. You have a respiratory system extracting oxygen and filtering out toxic carbon dioxide.
Right.
You have a rudimentary immune system fighting off pathogens.
Regulating an anatomy of that complexity completely outstrips the capacity of a simple, unmediated neural tube.
The stomach on a stick isn't going to cut it.
Right. Managing a simple organism is like managing a child's allowance. Managing a complex vertebrate with multiple organ systems is akin to running the central accounting and logistics department of a multinational corporation.
Wow.
The organism required a sophisticated centralized command center to ensure that the dozens of specialized metabolic resources were being distributed and balanced efficiently across thousands of miles of blood vessels and millions of individual cells.
And that command center?
That command center, that master biological accounting department, is what eventually evolved into the brain.
This completely upends the traditional narrative. The brain didn't evolve to write poetry or invent calculus or ponder its own existence.
Not at all.
It evolved to run an incredibly complex physiological budget. But what fascinates me is the methodology it uses to run that budget. It isn't just passively sitting there waiting for a predator to bite before it hits the alarm bell.
It cannot afford to be passive.
Yeah.
Because in predatory environment, metabolic lag is fatal.
If you wait, you die.
If you manage a corporate budget by waiting for an invoice to arrive before you even think about generating the revenue to pay for it, you will go bankrupt. You have to forecast, you have to anticipate expenses.
So how does that look biologically?
In biology, if an ancient Cambrian creature waited until the visual data of a lunging predator fully processed, and only then signaled the adrenal glands to release cortisol, and only then instructed the heart to accelerate to pump glucose to the skeletal muscles,
It's too late.
the creature would be dead before the glucose ever reached the muscle tissue. The reaction time is biologically too slow.
Meaning prediction physically beats reaction. It is a superior survival strategy.
What's fascinating here is that evolution ruthlessly favored nervous systems that could forecast resource needs. An organism whose primitive brain began to predict the predator's lunge based on contextual cues.
Like seeing the shadow or feeling the vibration.
Exactly, and prepare the internal body budget in advance, spiking the heart rate and flooding the muscles with energy before the attack actually occurred. That organism was exponentially more likely to survive and pass on its genetic material.
Because it was already primed to move.
Yes. Organisms that predicted correctly, or at least made non-fatal errors and adjusted their future predictions, dominated the ecosystem. Those that relied entirely on slow reaction, or those whose predictions were constantly wrong,
Wasting massive amounts of glucose running from shadows.
literally bankrupted their biological budgets and went extinct. The brain you possess today is the culmination of millions of years of selective pressure favoring a predictive engine. It is constantly, endlessly guessing when to spend metabolic resources and when to conserve them.
Okay, we have established the molecular and evolutionary reality of the brain as a predictive body budgeting organ. But let's be entirely honest here. That is not how it feels to operate a human mind.
No, it doesn't feel like that at all.
I don't walk around feeling like a glorified corporate accountant managing glucose levels. My internal experience feels like a constant negotiation of desires, logic, and impulses.
The human experience is very different from the biological reality.
We've all been in this scenario. You've just finished a hearty meal, you were entirely full, but you see a thick, decadent slice of chocolate cake on the counter.
A very familiar scenario.
You feel a massive primal urge to consume it, but you invoke your self-control, your rational mind, to suppress the urge and walk away. In that specific moment, it doesn't feel like a budgeting error. It genuinely feels like there are distinct separate entities inside your skull fighting for the steering wheel.
That incredibly intuitive, universal human feeling of an internal tug-of-war is the exact phenomenon that gave rise to the myth of the triune brain.
Which is what we're busting today.
Yes, it is perhaps the most successful and widespread scientific error of the modern era. In the mid-20th century, a physician and neuroscientist named Paul MacLean formalized this psychological feeling into a biological theory.
He actually mapped it onto the brain.
He proposed that the human brain evolved sequentially in 3 distinct layers, building upward almost like sedimentary rock in a geological formation.
And this wasn't just some obscure academic paper. This concept exploded into the cultural mainstream, primarily because the astronomer Carl Sagan wrote a book about it in 1977 called The Dragons of Eden.
It won a Pulitzer Prize.
It was a massive bestseller. It permanently installed this 3-layered brain concept into the public consciousness. Let's lay out MacLean's 3 mythical layers, because anyone listening to this has encountered these terms.
According to MacLean's model, The first, most deeply buried layer is the lizard brain, or the basal ganglia. He theorized that we inherited this directly from ancient reptiles, and that it is the sole domain of our most ancient automatic survival instincts.
The four Fs.
Right, the drives for feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproducing. Then he argued that as evolution progressed, a second layer was built over the lizard brain. He called this the limbic system.
The emotional layer.
He posited that we inherited this middle layer from early prehistoric mammals and that it contained dedicated, specialized neural circuitry exclusively for generating emotions like fear, anger, and maternal care.
And then the top layer.
Finally, layered over the very top is the massive, convoluted neocortex, which literally translates to new bark or new cortex. This outermost layer was deemed to be uniquely human, a recent evolutionary addition that served as the supreme source of rational thought, complex logic, language, and executive self-control.
The fundamental premise of the entire theory is a hierarchy of control. It suggests that the neocortex, specifically the prefrontal cortex behind your forehead, exists primarily to serve as a biological brake system.
A regulatory system.
Its job is to regulate, suppress, and civilize the animalistic lizard brain and the erratic emotional limbic system.
The irony is that MacLean was not discovering a new biological truth. He was mapping an incredibly ancient philosophical concept onto human anatomy.
Plato, right?
If we trace the lineage of this idea, it goes back over 2 millennia to ancient Greece. The philosopher Plato famously described the human mind using the allegory of a chariot.
The two horses.
He argued that human nature consists of 2 wild, unruly horses, pulling a chariot in divergent, chaotic directions. One horse representing our base, carnal appetites, and the other representing our fiery emotions.
And the person driving.
The charioteer holding the reins represents rational thought, desperately struggling to whip the beasts into submission and guide the chariot along a civilized, virtuous path. MacLean simply took Plato's moral philosophy of inner conflict and projected it onto the physical tissues of the brain.
The cultural penetration of this idea is absolute. The source text notes how you can walk into a supermarket today and see a special issue of the Harvard Business Review prominently featuring an article on how to stimulate your customer's lizard brain to secure a sale.
It's everywhere in marketing.
And right next to it on the rack, there will be a National Geographic special edition providing a colorful map of the brain's emotional centers. It permeates marketing, politics, pop psychology. But if we possess the internal experience of conflict, why shouldn't we trust that feeling? Why does this myth persist so stubbornly if the underlying science has moved on?
It persists because it is communicatively brilliant. It provides a dramatic, easily digestible narrative that perfectly mirrors our conscious experience. A story about noble reason battling primitive instinct is inherently compelling.
It makes a good story.
But more dangerously, it persists because it underpins the entire Western conceptualization of morality, legal culpability, and personal responsibility.
How so?
The triune model provides a biological justification for moral judgment. If your rational neocortex successfully restrains your primal instincts, you are deemed a good, civilized person. If you fail to restrain those emotional impulses, you are deemed immoral, weak, or inherently flawed.
I also think it acts as a colossal species-wide ego boost. Barrett points out that adhering to the triune brain theory is essentially awarding humanity a first prize trophy for best species.
Very much so.
It frames human beings as the absolute pinnacle of the evolutionary process, suggesting we are the only organisms on the planet equipped with this magical rational hardware that allows us to transcend our dirty animalistic origins.
It is deeply comforting to believe we are biologically separated from the rest of the animal kingdom by a thick layer of rational tissue. But biological reality does not care about our philosophical comfort.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and the timeline here is fascinating. You'd think the triune brain was debunked recently, but neuroscientists actually had the data to prove MacLean wrong back in the 1970s.
Right around the time Carl Sagan was popularizing the myth.
Let's talk about how MacLean got it so wrong in the first place, because he was a respected scientist.
The scientific community certainly had growing doubts. To understand the error, we have to look at MacLean's methodology. In the mid-20th century, neuroanatomy was highly visual and relatively rudimentary.
It was basically just looking at things.
Scientists would extract the brains of various animals, a lizard, a rat, a macaque, a human, inject the tissue with chemical dyes, freeze it, and slice it incredibly thin.
Like deli meat.
Exactly like deli meat. They would then place these translucent slices under a microscope and literally just visually inspect the stained cellular structures.
And what did they see?
When they looked at a human brain slice compared to a rat brain slice, they saw what appeared to be massive, thick structures in the human cortex that visually seemed completely absent in the smaller mammals. Based purely on naked eye observation of cellular architecture, they concluded that humans had evolved entirely new, massive layers of brain tissue.
Just by squinting at it. But the architecture of a brain isn't just about what clumps of cells look like under a microscope. It's about where those cells came from during the embryonic development of the organism. Modern neuroscientists aren't just looking at stained slices anymore.
No, they are utilizing highly advanced molecular genetics, and this is where the entire triune house of cards collapses. Modern techniques do not rely on visual estimation. Scientists can now track the precise genetic lineage of individual neurons.
Down to the gene.
They analyze the transcription factors, the genetic switches that turn DNA into specific proteins as an embryo develops. They can trace the origin of a neuron in a fully grown human brain all the way back to the specific embryonic cells it divided from.
And what did they find when they did that?
When researchers mapped the genetic development of the human brain and compared it to mice, macaques, and even ancient vertebrates like jawed fish, they discovered a common manufacturing plan.
A common manufacturing plan, meaning a human embryo and a mouse embryo use the exact same genetic blueprint to build a brain.
Identical in its foundational architecture, evolution did not suddenly invent new genetic pathways to slap a rational neocortex onto the human brain. The molecular evidence proves definitively that we do not have new parts.
No new parts at all.
The neurons that comprise the supposedly uniquely human neocortex have direct genetic counterparts in the brains of mice, birds, and even amphibians. Furthermore, tracing these genetic lineages proved there is no distinct isolated limbic system that functions as a dedicated emotional processing center.
So there's no emotional zip code in the brain.
The neural circuitry required to generate an emotional experience is distributed globally across the entire brain, utilizing the exact same pathways we use for memory, perception, and motor control. Emotion and reason are not segregated into different biological zip codes.
But wait, if we share the exact same foundational blueprint as a mouse or a jawed fish, how do we account for the massive physical difference? A human brain is undeniably larger, and our cerebral cortex is massively expanded compared to most other animals.
It is much larger, yes.
Doesn't scaling up the size of the cortex inherently mean humans possess a unique capacity for rational thought that a mouse simply lacks? How does a massively scaled-up structure not equal a fundamentally new, separate function?
Barrett anticipates this exact counter-argument and provides an exceptional structural analogy, the large kitchen analogy.
I love this one.
Imagine you walk into a standard, modest, suburban home, and you discover an absolutely gargantuan, commercial-grade stainless steel kitchen.
Just completely out of place.
Because the kitchen is wildly disproportionate to the rest of the house, you immediately assume the owners are professional chefs, or they run a catering business. You assume the anomalous size denotes a special, dedicated function.
Right.
But if you walk into a sprawling 40,000 square foot mega mansion and you see a massive kitchen, you don't assume they're necessarily chefs. You recognize that the kitchen is simply scaled up proportionally to match the massive footprint of the rest of the estate. It's just ordinary architecture functioning at a larger scale.
So a large kitchen in a massive house is just kitchen. It doesn't mean the inhabitants possess supernatural culinary abilities.
Exactly the same principle applies to mammalian neuroanatomy. Humans possess a large brain overall relative to our body mass, and the laws of evolutionary scaling dictate that as a mammalian brain gets larger, the cerebral cortex naturally scales up at a predictable, disproportionate rate compared to other brain regions.
In just math.
Our cerebral cortex is just a mathematically scaled-up version of the relatively smaller cortex found in the macaque monkey. And importantly, it is a mathematically scaled-down version of the massive cortex found in an elephant or a sperm whale.
Really?
If you were to artificially grow a macaque's brain to the exact overall volume of a human brain, its cortex would be virtually identical in size to ours.
That is a staggering realization. The sheer size of our cortex is not an evolutionary anomaly. It is not some special rationality zone uniquely granted to Homo sapiens. It simply grew according to standard biological scaling rules.
It requires no special evolutionary explanation, and it provides zero biological evidence that humans are a supremely rational species equipped to suppress an inner lizard. The scientific consensus is clear. You have one brain, highly integrated, built on an ancient blueprint and entirely dedicated to the predictive management of your body budget. There is no inner beast to tame.
This forces a massive recalibration of how we view ourselves. If the trained brain is a comforting fiction, and our brains are actually highly integrated predictive accounting departments, how does this system actually process the chaotic reality around us? Let's talk about the physical constraints of the brain. Because when you strip away the poetry, its actual physical situation is incredibly isolated.
It is the ultimate locked room mystery.
It's just stuck in a dark box.
Your brain is encased in bone. It is locked in a dark, completely silent box. From the moment of your birth until the moment of your death, your brain never directly sees the world, it never directly hears the world, it never directly touches anything.
It's completely cut off.
All it has access to is a continuous, chaotic barrage of ambiguous electrical signals originating from your sensory organs. It receives variations in light waves hitting the retinas, fluctuations in air pressure vibrating the tympanic membrane in the ear, and chemical compounds binding to receptors in the nasal cavity.
And the problem is, these electrical signals don't come with labels. A fluctuation in air pressure could be a beautiful symphony, or it could be a tree falling toward your head.
This is the fundamental meaning-making problem of neurobiology. The brain is trapped in the dark, receiving ambiguous signals, and it has to instantaneously determine what those signals mean in order to execute the correct body budgeting maneuver to keep you alive.
So how does it solve it?
It solves this problem through memory. It constantly, recursively searches its massive database of past experiences. It asks a highly specific, multidimensional question every millisecond. The last time my body was in this specific physiological state in a roughly similar external environment, what option did I take, and did it result in survival?
It's constantly referencing the past.
It pieces together fragments of past experiences to construct a hypothesis about the current sensory data.
Which leads to one of the most counterintuitive, mind-bending revelations in the entire source text. Because the brain is obsessed with metabolic efficiency, and because it relies on past experience to form a hypothesis, action actually precedes perception.
Yes.
Your brain prepares your body for an action before your conscious mind even registers what is happening in the outside world.
It entirely subverts our lived experience.
Yeah.
We operate under the assumption that we perceive a stimulus, process its meaning, and then initiate a reaction. But the brain's predictive architecture dictates the opposite. Barrett illustrates this with a profound real-world case study involving a soldier serving in the Rhodesian army.
This story is wild. Let's look closely at the sequence of events here, because it perfectly demonstrates the predictive engine.
This individual was deep in the forest, engaged in active combat operations. His brain was thoroughly primed by the terrifying context of a war zone. His internal predictions were heavily weighted toward detecting lethal threats.
So the soldier is moving silently through the dense brush. Suddenly, his auditory system detects a rustling sound. Because of his intense training and the hostile environment, his brain searches its database and predicts that this specific acoustic pattern represents a line of enemy guerrilla fighters armed with assault rifles.
The instant that prediction is formed, before he consciously registers the thought enemy fighters, his brain executes a massive allostatic maneuver. It prepares the biological budget for extreme action.
It's dumping resources.
It signals the adrenal glands to flood the bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline. It accelerates the heart rate to push oxygen to the extremities. It physically prepares the musculature of his index finger to contract and pull the trigger of his weapon.
Wow.
But the most astonishing mechanism is what happens in the visual cortex. To make the incoming ambiguous sensory data align with its high-stakes prediction, his brain actually constructed the visual reality of the enemy fighters. It altered the firing of visual neurons so that he literally saw armed men in the trees. He experienced the vivid, terrifying reality of an ambush.
He is a fraction of a second away from opening fire. But then a fellow soldier behind him simply taps him on the shoulder.
A physical intervention.
That sudden, unexpected tactile input interrupts the predictive loop. It forces his brain to pull in fresh sensory data from the environment. He blinks, the prediction updates, and the armed guerrilla fighters literally vanish from his vision. What was actually standing in the clearing? A young shepherd boy holding a wooden staff, guiding a small herd of cows.
His brain had entirely hallucinated a lethal threat. And from an evolutionary perspective, that hallucination was not a malfunction, it was a feature.
How is hallucinating a feature?
In a high-stakes environment, predicting a deadly threat and being wrong, hallucinating an enemy, is a metabolically expensive mistake. But you survive. Failing to predict a real threat, assuming the rustling is a cow when it's actually an enemy, is a fatal mistake. The brain's architecture prioritizes survival over objective accuracy. It will readily construct a false reality if that false reality prepares the body to survive a statistically likely threat.
I have to ask then, what happens biologically when a prediction fails that spectacularly? When the constructed reality violently collides with the actual sensory data?
The biological system faces a critical choice. The first option is to rigidly adhere to the internal prediction, effectively ignoring the contradictory sensory data from the outside world. This is what the soldier's brain was doing right up until the tap on the shoulder. It was overriding the visual data of a boy with a stick to maintain the prediction of a soldier with a rifle.
And the second option?
The second option is much harder. The brain must absorb the unexpected sensory data, acknowledge the massive prediction error, and expend significant metabolic energy to rewire its internal models so that it makes a more accurate prediction the next time it encounters a similar context.
And expending that metabolic energy to rewire the internal model is what we colloquially call learning.
Precisely. Learning is not just the acquisition of trivia. It is the fundamental biological process of updating your allostatic predictions. When we understand this, it forces us to reinterpret foundational scientific experiments.
Like Pavlov's dogs.
Consider Ivan Pavlov and his famous dogs. The standard narrative taught in every introductory psychology class is that Pavlov rang a bell, provided food, and eventually the dogs learned to react to the sound of the bell by salivating.
But through the lens of a predictive budgeting brain, reacting is the wrong framework entirely.
It is entirely wrong. The dogs were never reacting to the bell. Their brains were constantly predicting the metabolic future. The bell simply became a reliable acoustic cue that allowed their predictive engines to forecast a massive impending metabolic deposit, the food.
So they were preparing for the deposit.
To maximize digestive efficiency, their brains proactively altered their body budgets, initiating salivation and gastric acid production well before the food was even present. It was an anticipatory budgetary maneuver, not a reflexive reaction.
If every organism operates this way, if our brains are predictive, accounting departments entirely devoid of separate rational or emotional control centers, what happens when our entire society is built on the wrong model? This is where the source text moves from neurobiology into sociology. What is the actual crisis in perception here?
The crisis is systemic. It emerges because our core social institutions, our laws, our economic models, our healthcare systems, are designed to govern a fictional human being.
They're built for the triune brain.
Exactly. They're designed to govern a triune brain. When we mistakenly believe the mind is a battleground between reason and emotion, we interpret nearly all human behavior, especially destructive behavior, as a moral failing of rationality. We operate on the assumption that if someone commits a crime or makes a terrible financial decision, is because they allowed their inner lizard or their emotional mammal to overpower their civilized logic.
We blame the lizard.
This fundamental biological misunderstanding creates systems that are punitive rather than effective.
Let's trace how this infection spreads through our institutions, starting with the legal system. The law relies heavily on the concept of mens rea, the guilty mind, and the idea of deliberate rational intent.
And that leads to profound legal contradictions. Defense attorneys routinely utilize the crime of passion defense. The entire legal argument rests on the premise that the defendant's ancient emotional brain suddenly hijacked their rational brain, overwhelming their capacity for logical thought, and therefore reducing their culpability for the violence they committed.
And juries buy it.
Judges and juries accept this because it aligns with the triune myth. But if neuroscience proves that emotion and reason are not generated by separate, competing brain regions, if a violent act is just the brain executing a predictive allostatic command based on its internal models, then the entire legal distinction between a calculated crime and a crime of passion is based on a biological fiction.
It extends into economics, too. Macroeconomic models constantly try to map investor behavior by assuming a strict dichotomy between the rational actor, who calculates utility perfectly, and the irrational market participant driven by fear or greed.
Which is another false dichotomy.
But if every single decision, whether it's buying a house or panic selling a stock portfolio, is just a predictive calculation by the body budget, then an emotional market panic isn't a failure of human rationality. It is simply thousands of nervous systems simultaneously predicting a severe threat to their future resources and executing a coordinated protective withdrawal.
But the most urgent and paradigm-shifting application of Barrett's work is in the realm of mental health. The triune myth has caused us to view mental illness fundamentally as a mechanical breakdown. Let's examine PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, through the lens of allostasis.
How does the old model view it?
Under the traditional model, a veteran suffering from PTSD is viewed as having a broken brain. The assumption is that the trauma damaged their emotional regulation system, causing it to misfire uncontrollably.
But if we apply the concept of a predictive body budget, the perception changes completely. Imagine the brain of that Rhodesian soldier in an active combat zone. In an environment where the threat of death is constant and unpredictable, making a rational budgetary decision means maintaining a state of extreme hypervigilance.
It's the only way to survive.
It means the brain must constantly false alarm. It must continuously flood the cardiovascular system with cortisol and adrenaline at the slightest unexpected sound. Because in a war zone, failing to predict a threat is a fatal error.
In that specific context, hypervigilance is a brilliantly successful survival strategy. The biological tragedy of PTSD is not that the veteran's brain is broken or malfunctioning or irrational. The tragedy is that the brain's internal predictions are drastically out of sync with a newly safe environment.
The environment changed, but the prediction didn't.
The soldier returns to civilian life, but their brain is still rigidly utilizing the short-term budgetary strategy that kept them alive in combat. It is still predicting snipers and IEDs when confronted with a crowded supermarket or a backfiring car. It is executing a previously successful allostatic prediction in the wrong context.
That makes so much sense.
When we start viewing mental illness as a moral failing of rationality or a broken machine, and start viewing it as a severe budgetary mismatch, it fundamentally alters our capacity for clinical treatment and human compassion.
That is a profound reframing, and the complexity multiplies when we realize that our individual body budgets are not closed systems. They are not isolated islands. The text introduces this incredible, deeply unsettling concept called social body budgeting. Humans are entirely unique in the animal kingdom because we have evolved the capacity to physically, tangibly regulate each other's metabolic budgets, and we do it primarily through language.
It is the defining feature of our species. Many social animals regulate each other. Ants utilize chemical pheromones, rats utilize tactile stimulation and olfactory cues to calm each other's nervous systems. But humans evolved complex language.
And language is physical.
In the context of neurobiology, words are not just abstract concepts, they are tangible biological tools. When a trusted friend offers you a word of encouragement or a genuine compliment, it is not merely a pleasant psychological event. That acoustic signal travels into your brain, matches with a positive predictive model, and literally, physically alters your physiology.
It changes your actual budget.
It lowers your resting heart rate. It decreases the concentration of cortisol in your bloodstream. It optimizes your digestion. Your friend is using language to make a measurable metabolic deposit into your body budget.
Which means the inverse is equally true and far more dangerous. A hateful word, a toxic comment online, a sudden verbal threat. Your brain processes those acoustic or visual symbols, predicts impending danger, and executes a massive metabolic withdrawal.
It prepares for an attack.
It spikes your blood pressure, halts your digestion, and floods your system with stress hormones. We are completely unavoidably biologically entangled. Our nervous systems are continuously whispering to each other across space, constantly making deposits into and withdrawals from each other's physiological accounts.
Which brings us to a massive, unavoidable philosophical crossroads. If our brains are continuously shaped by the words of others, and if our actions are merely the result of automatic predictions based on past experiences, where does that leave our concept of personal agency?
So what does this all mean? If my brain is just a blind predictive engine locked in a dark box, automatically guessing what to do next based on data it collected years ago, and preparing my physical actions before I'm even consciously aware of them, do I actually have any free will? Am I just a biological automaton? Who is actually in the driver's seat?
The source text navigates this philosophical minefield with incredible nuance. The harsh reality is that you did not choose your initial wiring.
When you're a kid.
When you were an infant, your nervous system was completely malleable. Your caregivers constructed your niche, your sensory environment. They controlled the ambient temperature, the nutritional input, the language spoken around you, the level of physical affection, the degree of environmental stress.
All that data went in.
Every single interaction fed data into your developing brain, wiring its foundational predictive models. You hold absolutely zero responsibility for that early wiring. If you were raised in a chaotic, hostile environment, your brain efficiently learned to predict hostility and chaos to ensure your survival.
You don't get to choose the foundational code of your predictive engine. But, and this is the crucial empowering mechanism the author emphasizes, as an adult whose brain has fully developed, you are not permanently imprisoned by that early code.
You can change the inputs.
Because as an adult with agency, you possess the ability to alter your niche. You can actively choose the environment you inhabit. You can choose the social circles you engage with. You can intentionally challenge the deep-seated beliefs and prejudices you were swaddled in as a child. You can deliberately expose your nervous system to novel ideas, different cultures, and new ways of conceptualizing the world.
And the biological significance of altering your niche cannot be overstated. When you force yourself into new environments, when you deliberately engage in novel actions, you are feeding fresh, unexpected sensory data into your predictive engine. The new experiences you actively curate today become the new raw material, the new memories stored in your brain. And those novel memories become the foundational architecture for your brain's automatic predictions tomorrow.
So the implication is that if you consciously, actively practice a behavior today, let's say you practice patience or empathy or critical thinking, even if it feels incredibly difficult, exhausting, and entirely contrary to your early wiring, you are fundamentally altering your biology.
You are rewriting the code.
You are expending a massive amount of metabolic energy to rewire your internal models. But by doing so, you are literally programming your brain to automatically predict and output patience and empathy in future situations. It requires a grueling metabolic investment, but it grants you a profound degree of control over the future iteration of yourself.
Precisely. But as Barrett sternly notes, with that capacity for self-regulation comes an immense, almost terrifying level of responsibility. You cannot retroactively change the childhood environment that initially wired your nervous system.
Yeah.
But you are absolutely undeniably responsible for the predictions you are wiring into your brain right now, in this present moment, for your future.
Because you choose the niche.
You are responsible for the digital and physical niches you choose to inhabit, because those niches will inevitably shape your subsequent automatic actions. It is no longer about punishing yourself for the initial automatic uncharitable thought that pops into your head. It is about taking full responsibility for whether you allow that thought to reinforce its own predictive loop, or whether you expend the metabolic energy to update the model.
It completely shatters how we perceive human nature. We are not ancient lizards wrapped in emotional mammals, wrapped in rational, logic-driven humans, doomed to fight a never-ending internal war. We are incredibly sophisticated, highly efficient predictive engines. We are constantly running a complex biological budget, and we are continuously shaped by and tangibly shaping the people, the words, and the cultures that surround us. We are, quite literally, the architects of our own future biological predictions. Before we conclude this deep dive, I want to share a quick note with you. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.
To leave you with one final complex thought to mull over. We have established today that our brains literally construct our sensory reality based on what they expect to encounter, prioritizing metabolic efficiency above all else. We've also established that we possess the unique ability to physically regulate each other's internal energy budgets using nothing but words and symbols. So consider the architectural implications of this. What happens to our biology, to our collective physical and societal health, when we voluntarily immerse ourselves for hours a day in a digital ecosystem, our social media platforms, our algorithmic news feeds, that is specifically engineered to outrage us, to shock us, and to keep our body budgets in a constant, unyielding state of frantic, unregulated metabolic withdrawal? If words are biological tools capable of altering heart rates and cortisol levels, are we using our vast communication networks to build each other up, or are we systematically bankrupting each other's nervous systems?
That is a deeply unsettling, yet absolutely vital question to examine. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take care of your body budget, curate your niche carefully, and we'll see you next time.